Springtime in 1819 was the beginning of the most remarkably productive period in the career of John Keats. He had given up his study of medicine to try to make it as a professional author. For that reason, it is unsurprising that concerns like fame, ambition, achievement, whether one is simply good enough, creep into the Odes of 1819, which are very personal poems. To approach these texts, it can be useful to read Keats's letters, in which he often broaches the subject of what he thinks a poet is and does. In one letter from 1817, Keats tells his two brothers about a recent realization he has had about being an author, and you will find this in every critical study of Keats. He says, "It struck me what quality went to form a man of achievement, especially in literature, and which Shakespeare possessed so enormously. I mean negative capability. That is, when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason." Keats endorses willful obscurity. He prefers fragmentary information, which leaves some space for the imagination to operate upon it. You may remember similar ideas coming in when we looked at the rhyme at the Ancient Mariner, the notion that indeterminacy mobilizes the reader's imagination. Similarly with Keats, heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter, he tells us in Ode on a Grecian Urn. It's an imaginative process that begins with the kind of tantalization of incomplete information. Keats says that the poet must relish ambiguity and must not be plagued by insecurity over knowledge, which is just noise and interference in the creative process. And he welcomes the idea of poetic indolence, that creativity must occur in a relaxed frame of mind in which one becomes receptive and permits inspiration. At one point, Keats compares this to the meditating Buddha. Keats says more about the nature of the author as he sees it. In a letter composed 10 months after the negative capability correspondence, he writes, "What shocks the virtuous philosopher delights the chameleon poet. A poet is the most unpoetical of anything in existence because he has no identity. He is continually informing and filling some other body. The poet has none, no identity. He is certainly the most unpoetical of all God's creatures." Unlike the negative capability letter, Keats doesn't mention Shakespeare here, but Shakespeare remains very important. What Keats says about the chameleon poet is heavily indebted to William Hazlitt's lectures on Shakespeare, this idea of the author figure who can enter the minds of imaginary characters. Gusto, a word Keats uses, is Hazlitt's word for artistic power, pleasure or pain communicated to the strongest degree. Hazlitt says that underlying Shakespeare's imaginative versatility is the ability to forget his own character, to imagine himself as others. This is Keats's model, to be the chameleon, changing colour to suit his environment, a figure of self-conscious impersonality. Alongside negative capability and the chameleon poet, there is one more critical idea I want to take on before talking about some of Keats's odes themselves, and this is the sense of mortality, which is essential to Keats's poetry. He wasn't diagnosed with tuberculosis until 1820, by which time he had completed all of his major poetry. But I think that Keats had a foreboding sense of his own early death. His father had died when he was 9 in an accident, and Keats nursed his brother Tom, who died of consumption in 1818. And from this, I think Keats saw his own early death as a likelihood. In 1818, he wrote a sonnet troubled by a sense of his poetic career being cut off. "When I have fears that I may cease to be, before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain." Death was on the cards, weighing on his mind and driving Keats towards literary achievement. Keats's 1819 odes were all written between March and September of that year. We're not sure of the exact order, though he began with Ode to Psyche and finished with To Autumn. These are interrelated poems. They share themes, language, motifs, and formal attributes. An ode, as we understand the Anglophone term in literature, is a poem that pursues a single object of contemplation. Odes are long poems when compared to something like a sonnet, and short poems in comparison with narrative verse, which is the kind of poetry that tells a story. The verse structure of an ode is often elaborate. Ode to Psyche is the exception in this group. It has stanzas of varying lengths. The other odes of 1819 use 10-line stanzas of a quatrain of 4 lines followed by a sestet, which is 6 lines. And this form is derived from the Shakespearean sonnet. Both the quatrain and the sestet are aspects of a Shakespearean sonnet. Like what we said of Coleridge's conversation poems, Keats's odes tend to follow a movement. They have a 3-part structure which the critic Jack Stillinger identified. And the structure begins with an immediate object of contemplation. Then the poem builds in intensity and it concludes with perceptions of death or transience, leaving off with feelings of incompleteness or desolation. Some critics compare this to the stages of sexual arousal, which is consistent with Keats's reputation as the most sensuous of the Romantic poets. After his death, Byron complained that Keats was always frigging his imagination. Maybe there's more in that than just a crude dismissal.